By the time dawn broke over the contested ground, the German position was already complete. There was no sound of construction, no visible movement. Everything that could be prepared had been prepared hours earlier in darkness and discipline. This was not an improvised stand. It was a deliberate design, assembled piece by piece, with the patience of men who believed time itself was on their side. Mines lay buried beneath roads and verges, measured not by guesswork, but by calculation. Artillery crews had spent the night zeroing their guns, adjusting elevation and range, until every coordinate matched the map. Infantry units were folded into the landscape, tree lines, shallow folds in the earth, ruined structures that no longer looked like cover until a rifle barrel emerged from shadow. From above, the position appeared empty. From within, it was dense with intent. At command posts set back from the line, officers reviewed movements already predicted. Reconnaissance reports, intercepted signals, and earlier contacts had narrowed the enemy's approach to a narrow corridor. The Allies, they believed, would come forward cautiously, following the same routes they always used. The plan did not depend on improvisation. It depended on expectation. Watches were checked, timetables aligned. Each battery, each platoon, each reserve element operated on a shared clock, synchronized down to minutes. This precision was not ornamental, it was essential. The trap only worked if every element struck together. Then, at the edge of the prepared ground, movement appeared. Allied vehicles advanced slowly, exactly where they were expected. The first units crossed an invisible line drawn not on the terrain, but in German mines. The kill zone had been entered. Forward observers reported calmly. No alarms were raised. No adjustments were made. German officers waited for the signal they had rehearsed repeatedly, convinced the moment unfolding before them matched the plan they trusted. Confidence at that instant was absolute, and it was about to be tested. The signal came without ceremony. A single order passed along a wire, a brief transmission spoken in clipped tones, and then the battlefield answered in its oldest language, impact. German artillery opened exactly as planned, the first salvos landing not as random violence, but as punctuation. Shells struck the corridor in measured intervals, walking their bursts across the route the enemy had been expected to take. Almost immediately, the mines joined in. Under the lead Allied vehicles, the ground erupted in blunt, upward force. Metal tore, engines collapsed, and the forward column stalled in a tight, sudden knot. The explosions were not merely destructive, they were controlling. They turned movement into congestion, and congestion into a target. From concealed positions, infantry weapons added a sharper rhythm. Machine gun fire stitched the edges of the road, catching men as they sought cover in ditches that had been surveyed for exactly that purpose. Rifles cracked from tree lines and broken walls. The forward elements were pinned, their heads down, their options narrowed to inches of dirt and seconds of decision. In the command posts behind the line, radios confirmed what the maps had promised. Reports came in quickly, first vehicles disabled, enemy halted, fields of fire holding. Observers described silhouettes and smoke exactly where they should have been. It sounded, in those early minutes, like a textbook being read aloud. German officers allowed themselves small signs of satisfaction, measured nods, brief glances exchanged between men who believed they were watching discipline triumph over chaos. The trap was working. It was working cleanly. And for a moment, the enemy did appear confused, as if unsure whether to press forward or pull back, whether the road ahead was merely blocked or entirely owned. That appearance mattered. In war, perception becomes a weapon, and the Germans believed they had just broken the enemy's rhythm at the first strike. The temptation was immediate, to commit fully before doubt could return. So they did. Reserves were alerted, fire missions expanded, and the defensive line tightened its grip, convinced the opening blow had decided the day. But the battlefield was already offering a quieter question. What if that confusion was not collapse, but calculation? The German plan rested on a single expectation that had never been written down, yet governed every decision that followed. It assumed that once struck, the enemy would pause. That confusion would harden into delay. That command, somewhere behind the smoke and fire, would need time to understand what had happened before it could respond. Because of that belief, reserves were held back with confidence. There was no urgency in releasing them forward. The opening fires, commanders believed, had already done the decisive work. The enemy had been stopped. The rest would unfold according to schedule. Early anomalies began to surface almost immediately. Forward observers noted movement where none was expected. Radio traffic hinted at coordination rather than collapse. Artillery spotters reported targets disappearing faster than anticipated. These details were not alarming on their own. They were explained away as noise-inevitable friction at the edge of any engagement. Then something more unsettling occurred. After the initial violence, the battlefield grew quieter. Allied fire did not surge in retaliation. There was no frantic counterattack, no disorderly withdrawal, just an absence. To German officers trained to read hesitation as weakness, the silence felt reassuring. They misread it. What they interpreted as paralysis was, in fact, adjustment. Units were not frozen, they were moving differently. Command was not overwhelmed, it was reorganizing. But the German timetable had no place for that possibility. Every minute of silence reinforced the belief that the enemy had been stunned, not studying. The assumption hardened quickly. Guns maintained their planned rates of fire. Reserves stayed where they were. No one wanted to disrupt a plan that appeared to be succeeding. In war, confidence can be more binding than fear, and here it closed options quietly, without argument. By the time questions began to surface, why movement continued at the edges, why targets were no longer where they should be, the answers were already constrained. Adjustments now meant admitting the opening premise might be wrong. And that was the moment everything locked in. Because while the Germans waited for delay that never came, the enemy was already moving at a speed the plan had never accounted for. On the maps spread across German command tables, the position looked unassailable. Lines of advance narrowed neatly between natural obstacles, forcing any attacker into predictable lanes of movement. High ground dominated the approaches. Fields of fire overlapped with mathematical precision. It was the kind of defensive geometry German doctrine had refined over years of war. Prepared defense was something the German army understood deeply. From the early campaigns onward, it had relied on deliberate positioning, controlled engagement zones, and the careful synchronization of firepower. When time allowed preparation, German units expected to dictate the terms of battle. This plan followed that tradition faithfully. The terrain appeared to cooperate. Roads cut through low ground where vehicles could not easily disperse. Woodlines offered concealment for defenders while restricting the attacker's view. Every contour had been studied, every fold evaluated for advantage. On paper, there were no gaps, only funnels. Past success reinforced belief. Similar traps had worked before, often decisively. When Allied units encountered prepared defenses, they had frequently slowed, regrouped, and paid heavily for each meter gained. Experience suggested this battle would unfold the same way. The maps did not show hesitation, they showed inevitability. Logistics and fire support were aligned to sustain the position. Ammunition dumps were stocked for prolonged engagement. Artillery had pre-registered targets layered in depth. Reserves were placed where they could be committed with confidence once the enemy's intent became clear. The plan did not anticipate improvisation. It anticipated compliance. That was its quiet weakness. The structure allowed little flexibility. Deviations were treated as temporary disruptions, not signs of a different kind of fight. Contingencies existed, but only within the boundaries of the original assumption. As belief settled into certainty, the plan ceased to be a tool and became a doctrine in miniature. It did not ask what the enemy might attempt, only when they would fail. And somewhere beyond the neatly drawn lines, that certainty was already being tested by an opponent who had learned to read maps differently. The German understanding of the enemy had been shaped by patterns, not individuals. Allied forces were viewed through the lens of earlier encounters. methodical, cautious, and slow to deviate once committed. Under heavy fire, the assumption went they would halt, consolidate, and wait for orders to trickle down the chain of command. This perception influenced every layer of planning. Allied command was assumed to be rigid, burdened by procedure, and reliant on overwhelming force rather than speed. If struck hard enough at the front, the thinking held, the entire formation would hesitate. That pause was where German doctrine expected to win time, space, and control. What the plan underestimated was how much the enemy had changed. Allied artillery coordination had improved markedly by this stage of the war, as had radio discipline and decentralized decision-making. These developments were known in abstract, mentioned in reports and after-action summaries, but they did not fit comfortably with the image German commanders still carried. As the engagement unfolded, reports began to arrive that challenged expectations. Enemy fire was landing sooner than predicted. Movements were occurring outside anticipated axes. Engineers were appearing where the terrain was supposed to forbid them. These details were not ignored, but they were delayed, filtered, and softened as they moved upward. Arrogance does not always announce itself loudly. Often it appears as confidence that no alternative explanation is necessary. German officers trusted their understanding of the enemy more than the evidence forming in front of them. Information that aligned with belief moved quickly. Information that contradicted it stalled. This narrowing of interpretation had consequences. The longer the trap remained closed, the more initiative shifted away from those who had built it. Adjustments that might have been simple early on now required admitting that the enemy was not behaving as expected. By the time that realization began to surface, the Allies were no longer reacting to the trap, they were working around it. And the Germans, still waiting for hesitation that never came, were about to discover the cost of knowing the enemy too well. The next sign of trouble would not come from maps or doctrine, but from the front line itself. The first indication that something was off did not arrive as panic, but as inconvenience. Forward units began reporting fire from directions that were not on the map. It was not heavy at first, short bursts, probing shots, but it came from angles the trap was never meant to face. Communications slowed as messages overlapped. Platoon leaders tried to clarify what they were seeing, but their reports conflicted. Some described enemy movement along the edges of the kill zone. Others insisted the main body was still pinned. The radio net, designed for confirmation, now carried uncertainty. Artillery requests followed, and here the strain became visible. Multiple units called for fire on different coordinates, each believing their situation was the priority. Fire direction centers hesitated, recalculating target sequences that had been fixed hours earlier. Precious minutes slipped away as batteries adjusted from plan to reality. Infantry observers reported something more troubling. Allied elements were moving beyond the mined approaches. Ditches, shallow depressions, and improvised paths were being used to bypass the controlled lanes. The ground itself, once carefully measured, was no longer behaving as expected. At the command level, hesitation replaced confidence. Officers sensed that reacting too quickly might disrupt a plan still assumed to be sound. No one wanted to be the first to declare the design flawed. The instinct was to wait for clarity, to let the situation resolve itself. But clarity did not come. Time, which had been an ally minutes earlier, began to work against them. Each delay widened the gap between expectation and reality. The advantage of preparation depended on tempo, and that tempo was slipping away. The struggle began quietly, without a single dramatic moment. It crept in through delayed orders, overlapping reports, and small adjustments made too late to matter. By the time German commanders realized they were no longer dictating the pace, the enemy was already doing so, out of sight and accelerating. While German command searched for clarity, the Allies were already reshaping the fight. The geometry of the trap was identified not from maps, but from experience, where fire concentrated, where movement stalled, and where it did not. Within minutes, the pattern became clear. The road was deadly, the margins survivable. Allied artillery shifted its purpose. Instead of attempting to suppress infantry hidden beyond sight, guns began targeting German batteries themselves. Counter-battery fire rolled across the rear areas, forcing gun crews to choose between precision and survival. Observation posts that had directed the opening salvos were blinded or abandoned. Smoke followed. Thick screens rose across the German front, not as concealment for advance, but as denial of vision. Ranger finding became guesswork. Carefully measured distances dissolved into white space. For the first time, the prepared defenders could no longer see the battlefield they had designed. Engineers moved forward under that cover, cutting paths through ground the Germans believed impassable. Temporary crossings were thrown down, obstacles bypassed rather than breached. Each small deviation multiplied into freedom of movement the plan had never accounted for. Radios tied it together. Allied units communicated laterally as much as vertically, adjusting routes in real time. When one approach failed, another opened. Momentum was preserved not by brute force, but by decision speed. The effect was immediate and asymmetrical. The Germans lost visibility first. Without clear observation, artillery fire became delayed and imprecise. Infantry positions, once mutually supporting, began to feel isolated. The trap, designed to constrain the enemy, was now constraining its creators. Innovation did not arrive as a single breakthrough, but as a series of small adaptations executed faster than the defense could respond. Preparation had given the Germans a structure. Adaptation gave the Allies motion. And in war, motion carries its own authority. As smoke thickened and German guns fell silent one by one, the balance of control shifted decisively, setting the stage for firepower to begin turning in the wrong direction. Inside the smoke, German artillery crews continued to fire, because firing was what the plan demanded. But now each salvo felt less like control and more like habit. Without clear observation, guns were forced to rely on pre-registered coordinates that no longer matched the moving battlefield. The shells still landed. The damage still occurred. But it no longer shaped the enemy's decisions. Fire direction centers called for barrages into white space, hopping to catch movement they could not see. Ammunition stocks began to thin in a way that had not been anticipated this early. In prepared defense, expenditure is measured. Here, it became uncertain, rounds spent to buy confidence rather than results. Counter-battery fire intensified. Allied guns, working from better information, began bracketing German positions with increasing accuracy. A battery that had fired freely minutes earlier now found itself under immediate reply. The ground around gun pits cracked and erupted. Fragments cut through camouflage nets and crews. The message was unmistakable. Every shot revealed a location. Gun commanders faced an impossible trade. Stay and fire, risking destruction. Move and survive, surrendering the very accuracy the trap required. Many chose relocation, dragging pieces by hand or tractor through churned ground, abandoning carefully prepared emplacements for hastily chosen alternatives. As German batteries shifted, the minefields lost their purpose. Mines had been laid to channel enemy movement into killing areas covered by precise fire. But the enemy was no longer moving where the mines dictated, and the guns were no longer able to punish the routes that remained. Control evaporated in stages, first vision, then accuracy, then authority. What had been a designed wall began to dissolve. The trap's boundaries, once drawn by mines and guns, became suggestions rather than limits. German units found themselves responding to enemy movement rather than directing it, adjusting to surprises instead of forcing them. In war, that is a dangerous reversal. The moment a defender stops shaping the battlefield begins shaping the defender. And with every conflicting call on the radio net, it became clear that the next crisis would not be at the front line, but in the command posts struggling to hold it together. As the battle slipped beyond the boundaries of the original plan, German command posts became crowded with information and starved of clarity. Reports arrived in fragments. Batteries relocating under fire, infantry encountering pressure on unexpected flanks, observation posts gone silent. Each message was accurate in isolation. Together, they refused to form a coherent picture. Officers argued over interpretation as much as action. Some insisted the situation remained recoverable if the plan was held a little longer. Others urged disengagement before positions were compromised completely. The debate itself consumed time the defense no longer possessed. Reserves, once held with confidence, were finally committed, but too late and without precision. Units moved forward based on outdated assumptions, entering areas already affected by smoke, artillery, and shifting lines. Instead of sealing gaps, they found themselves absorbed into the confusion. Communication failures multiplied the strain. Messengers sent forward struggled to locate units that had already displaced. Radios, overloaded with urgent traffic, became clogged with overlapping requests and incomplete acknowledgements. Orders were issued, repeated, then revised before they could be acted upon. At higher levels, command began to contract. Decisions narrowed from shaping the battle to preventing collapse. Instead of coordinating fire and maneuver, officers focused on preserving connections, keeping units in contact, preventing isolation, avoiding encirclement. This was not panic. It was something colder, the realization that control was slipping faster than it could be restored. The system had been built for execution, not adaptation, and now every correction arrived one step behind the problem it was meant to solve. Leadership, in moments like this, becomes less about authority and more about endurance. German commanders worked to stabilize what they could, knowing that each minute without a clear picture strengthened the enemy's hand. By the time the argument over withdrawal reached consensus, the battlefield had already answered the question. The trap was no longer a position. It was a liability, and the moment of reversal was approaching rapidly. The turning point did not announce itself with a single breakthrough. It arrived as a realization, spreading unevenly across the battlefield. The Allies were no longer inside the trap, they were moving through it. Using the smoke and confusion they had created, Allied units pressed into the seams of the German defense. Gaps that had seemed insignificant minutes earlier widened under pressure. Where fire had once converged, it now arrived late or not at all. Movement replaced hesitation. German flanks began to unravel first. Positions anchored on the assumption of fixed enemy approach suddenly faced contact from the side and rear. Infantry units, trained to hold narrow arcs, found themselves stretched thin, reacting to threats the terrain was supposed to prevent. Artillery, already displaced and under counter-battery fire, struggled to re-establish effective support. Fire missions arrived after the moment had passed. Shells landed on empty ground as Allied elements advanced elsewhere. The rhythm of cause and effect had reversed. Withdrawal orders followed, but the ground offered little mercy. Routes planned for controlled movement became exposed under enemy observation. The same funnels designed to slow an attacker now restricted German maneuver. The geometry of the trap turned inward. As units pulled back, the illusion of control vanished completely. What remained was momentum, and it belonged to the Allies. Infantry advanced under covering fire, pressing gaps before they could be closed. Every successful movement made the next easier. The Germans were now reacting, not deciding. Each response came after the enemy had already shifted again. The trap no longer constrained Allied action, it constrained German options. This was the point of no return. Once tempo had been lost, it could not be regained through planning alone. The reversal locked in quickly, and what followed would unfold not as a battle of design, but as a race to escape the consequences of having trusted it too much. When the withdrawal began, it did not move as a single coordinated motion. It broke into pieces, platoons pulling back on instinct, gun crews abandoning positions in fragments, small groups seeking any route not already under fire. The plan had been precise. The retreat was not. Minefields that had once served as walls now became traps for their own makers. Lanes that had been carefully marked in calm hours were difficult to find through smoke and pressure. Vehicles hesitated, then clustered. Men moved on foot where they could, avoiding ground they themselves had ceded. The defensive architecture, designed to control others, now punished the Germans for abandoning it. Equipment began to disappear from the battlefield, not through enemy capture, but through necessity. Heavy weapons were left behind because towing them took time. Ammunition was discarded because carrying it slowed movement. Wounded men were pulled into ditches and behind embankments while units continued without them, driven by the brutal arithmetic of survival under artillery. As formations converged on the same escape routes, friendly units collided. Columns met unexpectedly at narrow crossings. Orders contradicted each other. A road meant for a single company became choked with mixed detachments, infantry, engineers, artillerymen, all moving with different instructions and the same fear of being cut off. Casualties spiked not because the enemy suddenly became stronger, but because disorder offered targets. Allied artillery bracketed the withdrawal lanes with growing accuracy. Small arms fire found exposed groups. The retreat amplified every vulnerability that preparation had once reduced. The collapse folded inward. Positions that had supported one another became isolated. Command messages arrived too late to prevent separation. What had looked perfect on paper turned into a maze in reality, and the Germans were now trying to exit a structure designed to keep others from moving. In war, failure often arrives faster than planning can accept. And as the last elements struggled to break free, the deeper consequence emerged. This was not merely a lost position, it was a lost tempo, and the enemy would not give it back. The Allies did not pause to measure what they had achieved. Momentum, once seized, was treated as something fragile, valuable only if used immediately. Units pressed forward through the disintegrating defense, exploiting gaps before they could be closed, advancing while German formations were still attempting to reassemble. German attempts to reset the line failed for a simple reason. Preparation takes time, and time was gone. New positions were chosen hastily, without the benefit of surveyed fields of fire or layered support. Artillery, short on ammunition and still under threat, could not provide the stable coverage required for a renewed defense. The engagement revealed a deeper truth about modern war. Carefully designed positions offer advantage only while the defender controls tempo. Once that tempo is lost, design becomes weight rather than strength. The Germans had invested heavily in structure, but structure proved brittle when forced to move. Doctrines struggled to keep pace with events. Procedures written for deliberate defense offered little guidance for rapid adaptation under pressure. Decisions that once flowed smoothly now required reinterpretation. Flexibility, something the enemy had cultivated out of necessity, became decisive. The fight ended not with a final stand, but with exhaustion and displacement. German units disengaged where they could, falling back to less favorable ground. There was no opportunity to reassert control. The Allies, having turned movement into advantage, dictated when and where contact would resume. In retrospect, the outcome seemed sudden. Hours of planning unraveled in minutes of lost initiative. The difference was not firepower or numbers, but speed of thought and action. Design had promised certainty. Speed had delivered reality. And as the battlefield fell quiet, the consequences began to settle in, counted not only in ground lost, but in the cost of discovering too late which quality mattered more. When the firing finally thinned, the scale of the loss became visible in fragments. The battlefield told its story not through grand gestures, but through what remained behind. Disabled guns sat where their crews had last tried to save them. Vehicles lay abandoned along withdrawal routes, engines intact but unusable under fire. The ground was crowded with evidence of haste. Casualty reports arrived slowly, compiled from units that no longer stood at full strength. Numbers exceeded what planners had anticipated for a defensive engagement of this scope. Many losses had occurred not during the opening exchange, but during the collapse, when movement replaced cover and order dissolved into survival. Heavy weapons accounted for a disproportionate share of the damage. Artillery pieces, difficult to extract under pressure, were destroyed or captured. Mortars and machine guns were left behind when crews chose speed over firepower. Ammunition stocks, carefully positioned for sustained defense, had been expended blindly or abandoned intact. Morale suffered in quieter ways. Veterans spoke less about fear than about disbelief, how quickly certainty had evaporated. Units that prided themselves on discipline now carried the weight of retreat. The confidence that had accompanied preparation did not survive contact with the aftermath. At higher levels, reports avoided definitive language. Losses were framed as setbacks, positions as temporarily ceded. The word failure did not appear, yet the terrain remained contested and the initiative was gone. Opportunity, once squandered, could not be reclaimed by wording. The accounting extended beyond numbers. Time had been lost. Flexibility had been exposed as insufficient. The enemy had learned something that could not be unlearned. As commanders studied maps now stripped of their certainty, one question lingered beneath the statistics. How much of what was lost had been men and material, and how much had been belief itself? The answer would shape what came next. In the days that followed, the battle was examined with care. Maps were redrawn, timelines reconstructed, and orders reviewed line by line. The intention was not only to understand what had failed, but why a plan that seemed flawless had unraveled so completely once the shooting began. The lesson was uncomfortable in its simplicity. Preparation, no matter how detailed, could not substitute for adaptability. The battlefield punished rigidity without hesitation. Control did not belong to the side with the best design, but to the side that could adjust fastest when design met resistance. Tempo emerged as the decisive factor. The Germans had assumed that by striking first, they would dictate the rhythm of the engagement. Instead, once that rhythm was disrupted, they lacked the means to recover it. The enemy's ability to learn and respond in real time proved more powerful than mines, guns, or geometry. Doctrine, however, does not change quickly. The structures that had produced earlier successes resisted reinterpretation. Admitting that flexibility mattered more than preparation required acknowledging that past victories no longer guaranteed future results. That realization came slowly, delayed by pride and institutional habit. Arrogance played its part not in bravado, but in expectation. The belief that the enemy would behave as predicted narrowed the range of possible responses. When reality diverged, adjustment lagged behind necessity. Reform, when it came, arrived after the cost had already been paid. The men who bore that cost were not abstractions. They were crews who had trusted their positions, infantry who had believed the ground itself would protect them, commanders who had followed doctrine faithfully. The lesson was written not in manuals, but in absence. War teaches relentlessly, but it charges in lives. And as the echoes of this engagement faded, its meaning endured, waiting to be tested again, wherever planning would once more be mistaken for control. After the movement stopped, the battlefield settled into an unnatural quiet. Smoke thinned and drifted away, revealing ground that no longer resembled the carefully measured space it had once been. What remained was not chaos, but abandonment, the stillness that follows rapid collapse. Across the terrain, evidence of preparation lay scattered and unfinished. Mines remained buried where no one would trigger them. Range stakes stood without guns. Dug positions, built to precise specification, were empty. The trap still existed in fragments, but its purpose had vanished with the men who were meant to hold it. Survivors remembered the change not as a gradual erosion, but as a sudden absence. Confidence had not faded, it had disappeared. One moment the plan governed every action, the next it offered no guidance at all. Control, once assumed to be permanent, proved to be conditional and fleeting. War, in the end, rewarded movement rather than certainty. Those who could adapt fastest shaped the outcome, while those who trusted structure alone found themselves constrained by it. The battlefield did not care how carefully it had been studied. It responded only to action. The maps would be revised, reports would be filed, lessons would be discussed in distant rooms. But for the men who had lived inside the plan, the memory endured in simpler terms. How quickly assurance turned into urgency and urgency into retreat. What had been designed as a perfect instrument of control became a reminder of its limits. The trap did not fail because it was weak, but because war refused to stay still. It had been set perfectly. And then, in moments, everything moved.